We took off about 10:30 in the evening. Then we headed out over the channel. We flew directly over the invasion fleet. It looked like the whole channel was moving. I didn't think there was that many ships in the world.
The Second World War, in many ways, marked the transformation of the United States into the most important global power of the 20th century. However, at the outset of the conflict, much of the country strongly opposed involvement. The pain of losses suffered in the First World War and the unpaid debts of many European countries were fresh in the minds of the population and generated rejection. Nevertheless, as the war progressed, the climate in the United States began to change. In today's video, we are going to explore the arc that led the American nation from staying out of the war to becoming the major protagonist of the conflict. Get ready for a dizzying journey through time in this new installment of military history. The roots of the Second World War are closely tied to the consequences of the First World War, especially to the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, which singled out Germany as primarily responsible for its role in initiating the conflict. This treaty involved land confiscation, the restriction of its military power, and the imposition of material reparations for the damages caused, significantly limiting Germany's economic and military capacity and generating extreme resentment among its population towards the European community. The Great Depression crisis further exacerbated the difficulties, as Germans had to face reparations payments. During this period, Hitler rose to power, promising to restore past prosperity and reclaiming German identity. Despite the treaty restrictions, the future Führer secretly built up an army and led the invasion of territories in France, Austria, and Czechoslovakia in 1936. Britain's appeasement policy, based on the belief that the treaty was unfair to Germany, supported Hitler's actions until the violent invasion of Poland in 1939, when the British and the French officially declared war to halt German aggressive military expansion. The context of such a pronounced economic crisis provided fertile ground for the emergence of charismatic and violent leaders who would ultimately unleash large-scale armed conflicts. In addition to Hitler and Germany, there was also a strong process of militarization and expansion in Japan and Italy where, in the name of intense nationalism and improvement in living conditions, the worst atrocities in modern military history were committed. When the Second World War broke out, the United States initially showed a marked reluctance to get involved. The nation followed an isolationist policy adopted after the First World War, which involved not intervening in global affairs unless there was a direct threat to the country. The aftermath of the First World War influenced the population, generating resistance to the possibility of facing another war. This sentiment was backed by specific laws, namely the Neutrality Acts passed in the 1930s, which essentially prohibited the United States from selling or exporting arms to nations involved in armed conflicts. If we make a quick and linear comparison, the onset of the First World War was much more direct compared to the beginning of the Second. In August 1914, a conflict escalation led the 5 major European powers into immediate war. In contrast, in September 1939, the start of the Second World War initially involved only 3 major European powers: Britain, France, and Germany. Later, other heavyweights joined: Italy in June 1940 and Russia in June 1941. In the Pacific, hostilities between China and Japan had been ongoing since 1937, affecting British and French colonies, which would soon be drawn into the conflict based on European territory issues. Now that we have the context, let's review how events unfolded for Americans to join the Second World War, the large-scale conflict between Japan and China in July 1937, as well as Germany's actions in the 1930s, including remilitarization, sending troops to the Rhineland in 1936, and the forced unification with Austria, seemed to have little direct impact on the United States. Even the invasion of Poland in September 1939 and the subsequent declaration of war by Britain and France did not, immediately sparking arrest among the American people. However, no one knew how far the delirium of Hitler's Aryan race could go.
And here they were bodies, they were dead bodies from men, women, and children in there. And then whenever we got inside, we saw the effects of what happened with we saw a lot of people dead that were in that camp. And you could hardly stand the stench, that was going on there. We saw the cremator, they cremated a lot of bodies. And then we saw the gas chamber where they put a lot of people.
Although President Franklin D. Roosevelt publicly expressed opposition to Japan, Italy, and Germany's aggression, the Congress, mainly controlled by Democrats, voiced strong opposition to intervention. This stance was based on an isolationist tradition, where many believed that the United States, shielded by vast oceans, should not get involved in foreign conflicts. Americans did not wish to participate in a distant war for the sake of China, nor did they want to contribute to perpetuating the British Empire. Furthermore, the slow recovery from the Great Depression, with persistent unemployment and agricultural problems, seemed to demand a focus on internal recovery rather than embarking on adventures abroad. But the situation took a drastic turn in mid-1940. Many Americans believed that the European War, as it was then known, would be a protracted conflict, resulting in the Allies triumphing due to their larger populations and global resources compared to Germany. However, Adolf Hitler's armed forces achieved swift and unexpected victories, eliminating France from the contest. The Third Reich took control of Western and Central Europe, while Mussolini's Italy opened a new front in the Mediterranean against Britain. This dramatic change of events posed a scenario in which, unless aid was provided, the United States would eventually have to face alone a Europe dominated by Germans at the peak of their power. The repercussions of the Axis advances in May and June of that year were global. French and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia, rich in resources, were open to foreign control or occupation. Even British colonies were threatened if the empire's military resources were concentrated in Europe and the Mediterranean. By September, this threat began to materialize when Japan deployed troops in northern French Indochina with the ambition of seizing as much Asian territory as possible. During the second half of 1940, the United States became a fundamental support for Britain, significantly increasing its importance in world affairs. At that time, Germany, Japan, and neutral Italy signed the Tripartite Pact with the intention of dissuading the United States from entering the war. The American public was alarmed by the Nazis' position in Europe. German air raids on London and other English targets, along with increasing German submarine attacks on British ships, generated sympathy among Americans. Despite this, Roosevelt continued to act cautiously as he was about to contest the presidential elections in November 1940 and sought a third term, avoiding taking any drastic stance.
Sociedad norteamericana.
More people were needed to produce the food and weapons for the men on the front lines. The new jobs were taken by many who had been out of work for several years. As more men were sent away to fight, women were hired to take over their positions on the assembly lines. Before World War II, women had generally been discouraged from working outside the home. Now they were being encouraged to take over jobs that had been traditionally considered men's work.
However, changes in American society began to be noticed. The victory in the elections gave Roosevelt greater freedom of action, but not a blank check to enter the war. Roosevelt used his presidential powers to implement decidedly unilateral neutrality measures in favor of the Allies, to avoid directly confronting Germany and Italy without substantial support. By the end of 1940, Roosevelt agreed to a Destroyers for Bases Pact, in which the United States would provide Britain with more than 50 destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases of territories in the Caribbean and Newfoundland, where American military facilities could be built. In March 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, carefully crafted to exploit legal loopholes in neutrality. Under this Lend-Lease system, the United States could lend military equipment such as tanks, planes, and artillery cannons, and postpone payment until a later date. Furthermore, this repayment did not necessarily have to be in currency. Although Americans were not explicitly participating in the war, they had become an arsenal of democracy, in Roosevelt's words. While these actions were happening with full knowledge of the population, the Allied governments had begun to weave more underground networks. In early 1941, secret staff conversations were held in Washington between British and American military leaders. In July of that year, a troop of Marines was sent to Iceland to relieve a British garrison. In August, Roosevelt and Winston Churchill organized a summit aboard warships off Newfoundland, issuing the Atlantic Charter. This document was a joint declaration against acts of international aggression and openly condemning Hitler and Nazism, as well as all its allies. What was not known was the cost that American soldiers were going to pay for entering the war.
I lost our general. He couldn't wear a helmet, steel. He wore a lighter. But if they ever caught us without our steel helmet on, they would court-martial you. They say, "That's your life." Well, they found half of his head off. It's devastating.
From September onwards, the President ordered the U.S. Navy to begin escorting British convoys. Although the United States did not break any international law with these actions, it was moving in a gray area that caused concern in all Axis countries. In parallel to these movements, Berlin sought to avoid at all costs actions that would lead to a declaration of war by the United States, such as submarine attacks on American merchant ships, as had happened in the First World War. This moderation had nothing to do with a search for peace by Hitler, but was motivated by plans to invade the Soviet Union first, which were set in motion in June 1941. The Third Reich planned that any confrontation with the Americans should occur after achieving victory in Russia and being in possession of its resources. In this reflection, Hitler's Nazi delirium can clearly be seen, which aimed to seize the entire globe. While in Europe they were avoiding confrontation with the American giant, things were very different in the Pacific. In 1941, Washington had become the main obstacle to the Japanese Empire and its expansionist desires. To dissuade Japan from occupying more Asian territory or entering the war alongside Germany, the United States applied strong economic sanctions. For example, in July of that year, the Japanese moved military forces to southern Indochina, and in response, the Americans froze Japanese assets and, along with the British and Dutch, suspended oil exports to Japan. Although the Americans had a diplomatic way out, they had put Japan in a tight spot, demanding that Tokyo end the war in China and withdraw from the Tripartite Pact to normalize relations, conditions that were inconceivable for Japan. Some historians have interpreted this firm stance as an attempt to provoke an attack that would allow Roosevelt to enter the war with Germany and Italy more elegantly. On the other hand, there are specialists who suggest that the United States underestimated Japan's determination and military capabilities, so it would have been a miscalculation and not a provocation. Despite negotiations in Washington with Japanese diplomats, civilian and military leaders in Tokyo decided to forcibly take control of British and Dutch resources in Southeast Asia. The Japanese especially coveted oil, a fundamental tool for Japan to maintain its position as a great power. Given Roosevelt's staunch position, Japanese leaders concluded that their actions would probably provoke the definitive entry of the United States into the war. The handling of leaders should not hide the fact that many young people went to war unprepared, as the testimony below recounts.
So that night, while we're there, we're on the side of a hill. There was one shot that was fired, And it sounded to me like it was pretty close, so I walked back and everything. And here I saw that soldier, 19 years old. He killed himself. One bullet, he put it in his head. Yeah, he couldn't take it. Probably fearful of what would happen.
The strategic position of the Philippines, controlled by the Americans, had the potential to block maritime routes from Southeast Asia to Japan. Tokyo decided to organize a series of surprise and devastating attacks, both against the islands and against the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. This would happen on December 7, 1941, in Hawaii. The intelligence available to Washington at that time after the Pearl Harbor attack, mainly from intercepted communications by American codebreakers, is a complex and controversial issue to this day. There are conspiracy theories that claim Roosevelt had prior knowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack, but allowed it to happen to declare war. However, the Pentagon categorically denies that version. Government sources assert that the intelligence available at that time indicated a possible, imminent Japanese action in Southeast Asia, potentially directed against Britain, but could not foresee the devastating attack on the naval base in Hawaii. The offensive against the U.S. naval base was a great military success for Japan, but politically, it turned out to be a strategic mistake. The attack was carried out without a formal declaration of war amid diplomatic negotiations on a Sunday morning and on U.S. territory, causing hundreds of casualties. Japan's mistake was to provide a narrative framework for the United States to declare war with all its arsenal, generating mobilization, unity, and fury in American public opinion. Equally questionable was the conduct of the European Axis. Roosevelt knew from decoded messages the week before the attack on Pearl Harbor that Germany and Italy were willing and prepared to go to war with the United States if Japan did. These errors can only be explained due to the vanity and egotism with which the three Axis fanatic leaders saw themselves. They believed they had already won the war. Astutely, the American president did not request a declaration of war against the Europeans, but only against Japan. In this way, Germany and Italy were forced to take the first step and declare war on December 11th, which put them in the position of initiating hostilities.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Germany was not obligated to go to war with the United States under the September 1940 Tripartite Pact, since Tokyo had initiated the conflict. However, Hitler had already opted for war. Many historians agree that this was the error that cost the Führer the war. The role of the United States in the Second World War was extremely relevant and encompassed various actions. After the attack on Pearl Harbor at the Arcadia Conference, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill agreed to prioritize support for the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the liberation of France, taking a decisive commitment in the conflict. On European soil, Allied forces, backed by the Americans, carried out crucial operations. Initially, they targeted North Africa, managing to expel Axis troops from Tunisia. They advanced into Italy, where in September 1943, they overthrew Benito Mussolini. The liberation of France began with the successful invasion of Normandy on the historic D-Day in June 1944, and by late August, Paris was liberated. The testimonies of soldiers devising strategies to survive are mobilizing.
Well, where that Jeep or command car went, we followed them, but all we followed was them two little cat eyes. But that's how they traveled, so that we didn't get shelled at night, because they were up there. We had pretty good success, but We had a couple of experiences that weren't too good, but that's kind of hard.
It was clear that the American power with which Hitler had handled so cautiously until that moment made a difference and unleashed like a firestorm on the Axis troops. In the Pacific Theater, the United States embarked on the task of defeating Japan, with whom it had a personal feud after the attack in Hawaii. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a crucial turning point, significantly weakening Imperial troops by destroying their aircraft carriers, which were key to their offensive strategy. Implementing the island-hopping strategy, U.S. forces gradually recaptured territories from the archipelagos occupied by Japan. Back in the European theater, the Nazis were losing ground, running out of resources and finding themselves cornered on German territory. In a joint action with the Soviet Red Army, the Americans tried a simple and effective strategy of encircling the resistance of the Third Reich in Berlin. The Russians would launch an offensive action from the east, while the Americans would corner the Nazis from the west. This epic final confrontation went down in history as the Battle of Berlin, which happened in May 1945. The Nazis' categorical defeat in the conflict marked Germany's surrender, culminating in the Allied victory in Europe. After the defeat of the Nazis, the United States still had to face and defeat Japan's staunch resistance. To conclusively end the conflict, the Americans took a controversial and decisive step. In a series of flights with state-of-the-art bombers of the time, the U.S. Air Force dropped 2 atomic bombs on the population of Japan, first on Hiroshima and finally on Nagasaki. The dropping of the 2 only nuclear projectiles in history occurred in August 1945, prompting the Japanese surrender in September 1945. Thus, the end of the Second World War was sealed. Although the war ended, the remaining tensions laid the groundwork for the Cold War, a period of ideological and political confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union that would define international relations in the following decades. The leading role of the American country in the Second World War made it the global protagonist of the West throughout the 20th century. Such power continues to this day. Thus, we are coming to the end of today's video. We thank you for sticking with us until the end and look forward to seeing you in the upcoming deliveries of military history.